Thank you to all of our general session panelists. Dan, thank you for your opening comments. At this time, I'd like to have each of our panelists kind of give an opening statement and tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and tell us a little bit about your passion and your work in energy efficiency in buildings. And we'll start with Dr. Danielson.
Well, great. Thank you so much. First, Dan, I want you to know your characterization of our building as being very inefficient is totally unfair. It's also very ugly.
Oh, yeah, yes.
So I wanted to confront you on
I'll
that
add
issue.
that next time.
Thank you. Completely unfair. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about my office, the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, and really 4 thrusts that we have as it relates to really trying to drive energy efficiency in this country. So quick 101 on my office, Office of Energy Efficiency, Renewable Energy, known as EERE, about $1.9 billion invested this year in research, development, demonstration, and breaking down market barriers in 3 sectors: sustainable transportation, renewable power, and important for today, energy efficiency. So, the Secretary Moniz, when he arrived, the very first speech he gave was about energy efficiency. And so I'll let you know that energy efficiency is really at the forefront of our agenda. We really see energy efficiency as the cleanest, cheapest, quickest way to achieve the President's climate action goals and to really lower costs for businesses around the country, and also an opportunity to really reinvigorate our economy and our manufacturing base. And so the 4th thrust I really wanted to put out, make you aware of, on one hand, we're really pushing with our partners to enable solutions that are going to give us the opportunity for 50% reductions in the longer term, 2020 plus. And that really involves 2 major thrusts. 1, next-gen technologies, and 2, working with partners to develop kind of integrated packages that can be demonstrated in the real world so that the private sector can pick these up and scale them. And then in the nearer term, though, it's very clear, I think, to all of us that 20% efficiency over the next, going into 2020 should be possible. It's sitting there with a good payback, but it's really a lot of market barriers that stand in our way. So the other 2 thrusts, thrust 3 and 4, are really about working with our partners to break down market barriers to the introduction of those currently cost-effective solutions, and then locking down savings through appliance energy efficiency standards. So I'm going to dive into those each very quickly. So on the next-gen technologies, we're making a ton of progress. I think everyone's seen, we've been working on LEDs for the last 10, 15 years, and we're at the point where we're seeing bulbs less than $10 at Walmart. And when those get to $3 to $5 is when this market explodes, right? And so we're already seeing good paybacks, but in that $3 to $5 range is where we're going to see an absolute revolution. I think it's already occurring. We're partnering with companies like General Electric to develop 60% more efficient hybrid water heaters based on heat pumps. And we're doing a lot of work in sensors and controls and a number of other areas. So that's kind of technologies that are really going to drive that 50% agenda. We've got partnerships in the residential side, really developing integrated packages in our Building America initiative, where we have teams of technologists and practitioners work together to really show how you can develop scalable integrated packages for efficiency. And then more recently, we funded the Penn State University Consortium for Building Energy Innovation focused on small and medium-sized commercial buildings to develop those integrated packages. And then if you look at the area of breaking down market barriers, we've got a wide variety of efforts, but I'll point out, I think the most important one is our Better Buildings Challenge, which was mentioned earlier. And in 2011, President Obama laid out a challenge to America's leaders to make the commitment to lower their energy footprint by 20% by 2020. And in the intervening years, we've seen more than 170 partners representing more than 3 billion square feet in this country take the challenge. And 3 years in, we're seeing across the whole portfolio of activity a steady 2.5% or more decrease in energy usage in the buildings in the challenge over the last 3 years. So we're on track to achieve these bold goals, which is very exciting. But what I also think is exciting is that it's about leadership, transparency, and results, the Better Buildings Challenge, right? So it's about stepping up and making the commitment, but it's also about sharing what you've done and what's worked. So we have already more than 80 showcase projects that have really published all of the approach that they took and given all the data out on the performance. And we've also seen more than 60 unique implementation models that are up on our Better Buildings Challenge Solution Center. So I encourage you all to check those out and be involved with the work that we're doing. In May, we're going to have our first National Better Buildings Challenge Summit here in Washington, D.C., and really encourage you all to attend to learn from what's going on and to be part of that movement. Today here we have a good number of Better Buildings Challenge partners who have taken the plunge. and I'll recognize them now: Transwestern, Jones Lang LaSalle, TIAA CREF, Forest City, Pennsylvania, the City of El Paso, Texas, the City of Los Angeles, California, Hilton, Schneider Electric, Sky Energy, and the DC government, DC bid. I'd like for those representatives to stand up and be recognized. At least one of them was here. And then finally, I really want, one area that we're building underneath the Better Buildings Challenge banner is what we're calling Better Buildings Accelerators. And these are really finding, forward-leaning utilities, cities, companies that are willing to take on specific challenges or opportunities to develop these scalable models. And so a couple of areas where we're really driving in accelerators with these partnerships is in whole building energy data, and in really driving energy service performance contracting throughout not only state buildings but also municipal buildings. So these are areas that we're pushing forward. And finally, I'll mention our Appliance Standards, which is a huge impact program under my purview. And so at the beginning of the Obama administration, we were actually behind and being sued because we were so far behind on our responsibilities to get these standards done and get these more energy efficient appliances out there. Since 2008, we've passed a large number of new standards representing 1.8 billion tons of CO2 emissions avoided by 2030. And the president has laid out a bold goal that we need to achieve 3 billion tons total by the end of his second term. And so that gives you kind of a portfolio landscape of the work we're doing. Excited to partner with all of you more, and I'd really like to encourage all of you to join the Better Buildings Challenge and would love to partner with you there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yep.
Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate GSA on their leadership. It's hard to believe, because I'm so young, of course, that 20 years ago I was working with GSA and Kevin on the first green cost study, where you were looking at what the cost commitment would be that would be necessary to green the federal workplace. So you have been leaders for a long time, and I thank you for that. And I think that what I'd like to make a few remarks about this morning is the importance of leadership. It's easy to talk about gadgets and widgets and cell phones and all the rest of that, and all of that is incredibly important, but you can take the horse to water, but can you make it drink? You can have incredible infrastructure, but can you make sure that the facilities managers are up to speed and are actually driving that Prius as it was intended, and not, sort of hampering with it or driving it like a Maserati? So I think that people are the challenge, people are the solution, and leadership is what will get us from point A to point B. And certainly, Skanska has embraced this for about as long as USGBC has been a leader in the area of sustainability. Skanska has endeavored to be so as well. We have committed to the reality that standing still is not an option, and so even though we've been in this game for a long period of time, there is a huge amount of work to do. I think that all around us, surrounded in this room, we are by terrific leaders, and I'd like to start by saying that the District of Columbia is also, I think, an underappreciated leader in this regard, and I'll make a couple of shameless plugs for a session that I'm going to be moderating a little bit later this morning, C2. Bill Updike and Sam Brooks are here from the District of Columbia. I'm looking at you, Bill. You can stand up. And where's Sam? Not around quite yet. They have observed that the cool thing about the district is that it's sort of like a city-state, right? So you can move a lot faster than perhaps other places in the union. And it is breathtaking what they have been able to accomplish. I think that we had a conversation the other day about finding the right incentives and really engaging in a thoughtful conversation with the community you serve, and I applaud you for that. I think that having a leadership culture is also really important. Executive leaders need to say that this is important and that we are going to take that mountain, and that even if it's difficult, we are going to stay the course. And that leadership needs to be driven down through organizations, and you need to staff people in the four corners of your organization that look at the world through a sustainable lens. The notion that business and sustainability are somehow mutually exclusive is yesterday's news. It's a imperative. It's a business imperative today. And John Koster is sitting here, brave man in the front row, from Skanska, who is driving our green business initiative within Skanska. So we see it as a terrific business opportunity. Our civil division within Skanska, which I now have an opportunity to work with, is an interesting lot because they are just beginning their sustainable journey, or at least they're just for the first time calling the things that they've been doing for decades sustainable. Efficiency in terms of how we build is inherently sustainable. But on the civil side, because they haven't had the benefit of LEED, Envision, which is the civil version of LEED, is just now emerging, is beginning to create a lexicon for talking about leadership there. And also I'd like to make two other shout outs before I turn over the mic. One is for financial institutions who are finding new and creative ways to harvest future energy savings to pay for retrofits today. And we're just beginning to see a lot of this come onto the market, and I was hoping that I'd be able to talk about a project that we've been working on today, but we're still getting that off the ground. And so I can't mention it quite yet, but I think that the other part of this is that the financial vehicles are coming around, but it takes time because we're essentially trying to bring together new constituencies to create really transformational solutions, but it takes a dialogue across players who aren't used to being around the table. So patience, I think, is also important. A 1 quarter or a 1 year business cycle won't cut it. And then finally, the U.S. Green Building Council, of course, I'm a little biased because I was on their board for 6 years, I think has also done an extraordinary job at broadening what was really a little pup tent into a big top and opening the dialogue to a broader array of discussions, certainly beyond energy, beyond environmental, and taking a look at human health and taking a look at underserved communities. And in the session this afternoon, we'll be talking in D4, another shameless plug, about LEED version 4. And I'm delighted that Eden Bruckman from the Health Product Declaration Collaborative, Eden, is here to talk about the importance of materials, because once you build a very efficient building, if you fill it full of noxious materials, you're creating a perfect gas chamber. So it's a broad dialogue, and I look forward to seeing all of you in those sessions later today.
Great, thank you, Beth. Clayton?
You know, before I start talking too much, I probably should warn you that I not only talk a little bit funny being from Texas, but I also may be a little bit tainted. I'm probably the only one in the room whose boss, leader of a large real estate company, actually knows more about sustainability and energy than most of us in the room. Jerry Hines is a degreed mechanical engineer before he got into real estate. And so it's real interesting to be sitting in your office doing what you're supposed to be doing, and the next thing you know, you look up at there, Mr. Hines. What are you working on? What are we doing different? What did you do yesterday? Do you remember the last time we met? What did you do with all that? And so it's in our DNA. We've been tracking energy before there was calculators. We used to track our energy on our buildings on a accounting ledger sheet and do all the calculations by hand and then try to produce energy reports from that. And it's really enriching and rewarding to seeing so many people now focused on it and caring about it. And I really believe that all the people and all the companies represented in this room deserve a great big congratulations for what you've achieved over the last 40 years. As energy's gone up from about 1.8 cents per kilowatt hour in 1970 to a national average of about 10.2 cents per kilowatt hour today, the people and the companies represented in this room have steadily been making products and new innovation and new buildings that actually have countered much of that cost. I stagger to think about what it costs to operate our buildings today the way they were in 1970 with the energy costs today. A couple of examples. Chiller. Chiller energy consumption has been reduced from 0.9 kW per ton to 0.5 kW per ton, with part load efficiencies achievable of 0.35 kW per ton. Lighting's an outstanding example. In 1970, the typical office building had 4 watts per square foot. Today it's less than 1 watt per square foot. And with even basic lighting controls, we can operate that lighting much more efficient than we did in 1970. Variable frequency drives, which were virtually unknown of in office buildings 40 years ago, are commonplace, substantially reducing the amount of energy it takes to move water and air in our buildings. Air distribution systems, the day and the age of the large inflexible central systems and dual duct mixing boxes and reheat systems is all gone. It's all been replaced by a much more efficient air distribution system. So what's over the hill ahead? I think the pathways of what we would call passive energy efficiency gains will certainly continue in the form of better, more efficient products and innovative designs. However, one of the things I think we all need to think about is when you get past the passive, you can put in windows, new windows, better insulation, and I call those passive things because once they're designed, innovated, and installed, they tend to not take much maintenance. But on the other hand, we're making our buildings much more complex, and in order to keep and maintain this efficiency bar that's established through these new products and materials, it's going to take a different group of people. Let's take a simple example, lighting. Let's think about the lighting in 1970. The typical lighting in an office building was a series of 40-watt fluorescent tubes powered by a magnetic core ballast that was turned on and off by a light switch. Pretty simple, straightforward stuff. We learned that the fluorescent tubes lasted 20,000 hours, roughly 5 years. The ballasts were always good for 20-plus years. And you know what? The light switch seemed to never break. Low maintenance, easy to understand, easy to troubleshoot, and very dependable. And in the quest for energy efficiency, we're replacing these systems with T5 bulbs, electronic ballasts, LEDs, lighting control systems consisting of substantially more points than today's automation system for the building. These new systems are measuring the available light, raising and lowering shades while modulating the light levels to meet desires of the individual occupants, something we could never do before. Similar progress and changes are being made throughout the building infrastructure, the HVAC controls. We're putting the interior shades in, the elevators are more efficient, the glazing is more efficient, the domestic water pumping systems, the tenant use of the space and the devices they use and so on. These accomplishments represent an outstanding achievement in reducing the energy of our buildings. No doubt about it. And everybody that's had anything to do with it should take pride in the progress that's been made. However, something we don't hear much about, that my experience has shown will be extremely important to the performance of these enhanced systems, is the ability of the operating engineers in each of these buildings. In surveying more than 1,000 buildings over the past 30 years, I've concluded that only a small percentage of buildings today are operated optimally. I'm convinced much of the ultimate performance of these new outstanding products and designs will be dependent on the wizards behind the curtain that take pride in optimizing these new resources and energy efficiency tools. Much of our collective success will hinge on the building engineers progressing substantially as we change the guard from the old guys of the mechanic years to the new young guys growing up in the electronic computer age. Any investment in the wizards behind the curtain by the industries and the people in this room represented here today will certainly yield high dividends and ongoing challenge to make our real estate as efficient as it can be and continue the journey to true net zero energy buildings becoming the norm, not the exception, and leading the U.S. to energy independence. Thank you.
Thank you. Nino?
Darlene, thanks. First thing I want to say is thank you very much. We appreciate you and Core Advisors having us here. We appreciate the opportunity to sponsor it. There's a lot of our users and customers in the audience consume our products, so we appreciate that very much. Thank you. We have probably a little bit different perspective, or at least I do. I grew up in the technology business, software technology business, more than 25 years ago. So one of the reasons that I got into the business coming out of school was because it certainly was an area that was growing and interesting. I started at Ross Perot's EDS Corporation. Some of you may remember it's now part of Hewlett-Packard. And it was something that was changing dynamically, and it changes dynamically every couple of years, right? We see inflection points constantly in technology. So we're the guys that ask the whys and the whats and how things get empowered and how they get enabled. And then we make the bets on that, and we make the bets on, and hopefully more than 50% of the time, we make the right bets on the technology. So the way that we look at everything that's happening, and over 20 years I can tell you that The building segment isn't the first one I've been in. I've been in industrial manufacturing, retail, financial, et cetera. And a lot of the convergences of the various technologies make it real interesting for why you can enable a lot of these things. So from our perspective, the things that shape our thinking to try to enable everything that you want to do, all the things that these individuals have talked about, are a number of different technology trends. And they're kind of pretty fascinating. So when I started in this business 20 plus years ago, everything was dumb. We had dumb terminals. I hope you guys are all as encouraged as I am that everything's smart now. So we have smart buildings and smarter planets and all that. So for the last 20 years we've been dumb, but we're getting smarter, so that's good news, right? So when you take a look at that, you look at the first area that we've looked at is the devices themselves, right? They're proliferating at a rate that we've not seen before in our technology business, right? So you've got the power and the form factors are moving ahead, probably ahead of Moore's Law, the doubling of capacity every couple of years, right? We've got the PDAs. I mean, the business was invented effectively by BlackBerry about 10, 12 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that now in the late 90s. And now BlackBerry's struggling to survive, right? They're trying to figure out where their core is. So you look at the telephones and the PDAs and what Apple's done there, and now you look at the form factors changing, the tablets. Just 3 years ago, you really weren't going to buy an iPad. There was a big debate about the iPad and that form factor, and were you going to buy cellular, or were you going to just buy Wi-Fi connectivity, pay the extra $100 for the cellular connectivity. That's a much different discussion just 3 years later because of what? The penetration of connectivity as well, right? So Wi-Fi is just about everywhere. You get the cell connectivity. AT&T's much better at that than they were a number of years ago. So now you can make a couple of decisions on what kind of carrier you want based on your needs, right? Whether you have just wireless telephone needs, whether you have data needs, et cetera. The prices have plummeted on all that over the years. Clayton did a nice job of just talking about the change in pricing on the energy side. But if you look at the things that drive the connectivity, the devices, the power of the devices, I had a birthday recently, and the guys gave me, I have 4 small children, so they gave me something they thought was pretty cool. Just a little jump drive, that's shaped like, the Martian on Bugs Bunny, right? They thought that was pretty cool. So then they proceeded to tell me it was $8. So I had a conversation with my wife later about my birthday gift being about $8, but that's a different story. There's 16 gig of storage on that. 16 gig of storage on a little jump drive that just a few years ago we were giving away 128 meg as gifts at conferences like this, and those were costing us $4 or $5 each, right? Even if we were buying them in bulk. Now $8 gets you 16 gig, your iPhone at a couple of $100, right? So you've got the form factors, the proliferation of the devices, the compute power on the devices has plummeted dramatically, so now we can do a lot more with those devices. The battery power has quadrupled in the last few years, and the storage capacity on those devices. So that's enabled a lot of the things that you talked about that you want to do here on little devices, access anywhere, anytime, right? So the forecasts are kind of interesting. Some of you may already have seen them in the various reports, right? But we've already passed the number of compute devices on the planet versus the population, right? We surpassed it somewhere in 2009, 2010. So forecasted into 2020, there's going to be somewhere in the area of 50, 60 billion of the mobile devices, right? Which is about 6.5 devices per person. So if you're only carrying 2 now, you're not very cool. You need to be carrying another 4 or 5, right? Now those will change though, right? Because there'll be the telephones and the tablets, and there's phablets coming out. If you're not familiar with those, they're fat phones or small tablets, right? They're calling them phablets. They got all the great marketing names on them. But we mentioned earlier Nest, I think. Darlene's a big fan of Nest, right? So now the home becomes a node on the network. Your cars, right? You're playing a lot with smart cars. And then, of course, the propulsion systems on cars, right? So we look at all that technology and say, how do we bring that all together for our... So Tritium's a software company and a hardware. We provide technology solutions that enable a lot of this. The last thing we're seeing is the ability to consume the data and then actually drive changes. So data modeling with big data, cloud, that was around 20 years ago. I saw our first forays into that at EDS in the 92, 93 timeframe. But there wasn't the desire to consume the data at that time. So a lot of our initiatives fell because Well, we built the big data warehouses and we had the big data and we could provide you some dashboards and things. But the desire to consume the data, the desire to make changes to whatever was happening at the time, whether it was a manufacturing facility, a building, was much more limited. You were looking at things like how do we build better light bulbs, et cetera, as you said earlier, and how do we design the building, right? Well, now all that is table stakes. So now it's how do we control it better, how do we drive better decision making. And so the opportunity to consume that data, the opportunity to do analytics on the data, because we've got so much compute power, has changed dramatically just in the last couple of years because of these types of technology advances. So it's made it a really exciting place for us to be. And we're making a lot of bets with millions of dollars in our R&D on a lot of these things to enable it. We're going to continue to double down in the building space because that's going to be a large portion of energy consumption. It's up to about 40% of a smart city, quote unquote, smart cities now, because our cities are smarter now. Apparently we were dumber before, again, but we're getting smarter, so that's good news. And so when you look at that, the buildings are going to be a big piece, but even more what's happening inside the buildings. So there's a big convergence of the data. So if you look at buildings, you've got things like data centers, right, which is a building, but then there's the white space inside the data center, the compute environment, industrial assembly lines, right, and then a lot inside the cities, not just buildings inside the cities, but smart traffic management systems, et cetera. Those things are all driving a convergence. We're seeing convergence between the traditional facilities organizations and the IT organizations. They're coming together and having good, healthy dialogue, sometimes contentious, but healthy dialogue around how to manage. If you want to put the building on the network, if you want to be able to analyze the data and have connectivity, then IT organizations are starting to get involved in that because it's going to touch the network, it's going to touch the backbone. And so we're starting to see dialogue there, and actually buying decisions changing, moving from one group to another, which is always real positive. I think the last thing that I'll leave you all to think about that I've seen in the last 20 years, and it's been driven by all these changes in technology, but also a real high desire for everyone to get involved in the technology space. Usually the technology, and I can say this because I've been one of them, usually the technology piece, the information technology, the software and the compute devices was left to us geeks that were sitting inside the IT organization. The level of competency, the understanding of compute, data, connectivity has raised dramatically in the last 10 years, which is fabulous across the entire population. All of this, people are much more interested. It's been driven by the proliferation of apps, the proliferation of the connectivity, and even wildly successful technology companies like Google and Facebook, right? If you had told me about 10 years ago that social networking, which is, by the way, what we're all doing here today, right? I guess Zuckerberg just took about $3.5 billion out of Facebook for his equity shares, right? So apparently we've been all underpaid for social networking over the last few years, right? We've been doing it for 20 years, but I guess if you do it in the virtual world, it's worth a heck of a lot of money. So all those things have changed the landscape dramatically from our perspective, from a technology. So we're continuing to invest in a lot of those technologies to bring more efficiencies to the way you can use our products, more effectiveness in the way those products enable you to make decisions and changes, and just overall better products that are easier to use and with their industrial design. Apple's changed industrial design forever, right? The products need to look good, need to look cool, need to be elegant, right? It's no longer just having a control device, if you will, to your point earlier, Clayton, the light switches, right? Those light switches need to look cool now. They can't just turn lights on and off, right? They need to look cool. So Apple brought that to us, and it's changing the landscape. So the reason I got into the business many, many years ago is all this dynamicism, and I'd say over the last 5 to 10 years, but probably the last 3 to 5 more, it's changed at a more rapid pace than we've ever seen before, which makes it a lot of fun and gives you all the opportunity to consume things you haven't consumed before and drive changes and improvements in the landscape that hasn't been seen for many, many years. So it's an exciting place to be. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Well, let's talk a little bit about how that technology is really shaping the future of efficient buildings. One of the things that, Beth, you had mentioned is the leadership. You need to have leadership within the organization. One of the other things that each organization needs is the drivers and the mandates and the motivations that drive you to do something. So Beth, I want to start with you. What are some of those motivations and mandates that are driving your organization towards energy efficiency and sustainability?
Well, internally, I mean, we have our own internal green strategic indicators that we take a look at, and a lot of the work that Skanska does as a builder is for others. So We also look at what our clients are doing and map that across our portfolio of work globally. And then internally, we have leadership goals. All of our commercial development projects, and we're no threat to Heinz, trust me. We have a very small operation, comparatively speaking, but it's really terrific that we have an opportunity to build for our own account. So we have a commercial development group that builds and then flips buildings. But as our first invest client, they give us an opportunity to experiment on some of these emerging technologies on every one of their projects. They have a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious green goal. And that, as GSA's program, allows us to experiment and then translate that experience to other clients, specifically understanding what the cost ramifications are as well. Because a tremendous barrier to adoption, and I know I'm wandering a little bit, but a tremendous barrier to adoption is this perception that it's too expensive. And so by incorporating these BHAG goals and demonstrating that in fact it's a good life cycle solution, we can embolden other clients to follow in our path.
Well, you've noticed that we have deliberately brought together public sector, private sector, and technology, and you'll see that very consistently throughout the conference today. And one of the reasons we've done that is because there are very different drivers and goals and mandates and different things that different types of organizations focus on. So Dan, from GSA's perspective, what are the major motivations and drivers pushing you towards that energy management and sustainability program?
We've got a really great motivation in the form of an order from the commander-in-chief, right? It's pretty simple in that regard. But I actually think in a more complex way, it's driven in part through tremendous relationships with organizations like the Department of Energy, who are helping us be smart about the way we pursue them and studying different alternatives and teaching us a way forward. We also have tremendous pressure, financial pressure on all the agencies that are forcing the agencies to start looking at the baseline in a way that they've never had to do, at least in recent memory, and ask themselves, how do I take that baseline and convert it back into program, because demand for federal services continues to increase. So what we have then is really the perfect storm of clear executive leadership, management focus and attention and energy, as well as kind of a groundswell of pressure on folks to try to find ways to save money. And so in the midst of that, then, we have the opportunity to demonstrate to the more efficient use of existing space. And that means being more efficient in the way we use the space, both physically and the way we operate it. We can actually return savings to agencies that they can put back into programs.
Now, with such a massive portfolio, as not only the largest owner but also tenant in the U.S., how do you manage that across such a large portfolio and maintain quality and consistency?
No, I think you've just described our biggest challenge. And I frankly think efforts such as GSA Link are efforts for us to get a better handle on that huge portfolio. We're broken up into 11 regions, and the 11 regions have 11 slightly different ways of doing things, including 11 different building management systems or implementations of even the same building management system. That's the kind of thing we're trying to fix. We're trying to fix it with GSA Link. We're trying to fix it with a comprehensive single maintenance management system across our facilities, and we're just trying to raise the bar and the quality of the dialogue, both within our organization but also with our customers.
Mm-hmm. And Clayton, also with Heinz, I mean, obviously a massive portfolio. How do you maintain that quality and consistency for energy management across your portfolio?
You know, I used to think it was hard here in the U.S., and then we got into 18 different countries, and I figured out that the U.S. was really pretty easy. We actually have a proprietary system that all our buildings use to track and monitor their energy, and we have it supported by 4 engineering standards that require them to, one, use our system, leverage the data in the system, be focused on energy operations, be focused on energy reduction, and be focused on the education of their staff. And so it's really a fundamental core of the company that just seems to work actually better than you might think, because the people we hire believe in it and want to do it, and they also understand they're going to get an audit someday.
Great. Dr. Danielson, I know you have a strong background also in clean energy and technology. Can you kind of tell us how you see that playing into the whole intelligent buildings movement and where you see technology taking us down to the next step of efficient buildings?
Great, thanks for that question. So I started my government service. I was a venture capitalist, and I came into government, and initially with ARPA-E, which is kind of like the DARPA for energy. And so it's really about out there ideas. So I wanted to tell you about one crazy idea that we got a paper on to start with, and then I'll get serious. The most interesting, crazy idea we had in the building efficiency space was the idea of having a whole bunch of mid-infrared lasers around the room. And so they would directly heat all the human occupants instead of heating all the space. That one didn't make it through the first review, but I thought it was very clever. One area that we have begun to get serious about at the Department of Energy, where we hadn't before, I think it relates to a lot of what's been said on this panel, is the idea of intelligent efficiency, looking more at the dynamics of grid interaction, and interaction amongst buildings and amongst devices. Whereas we had focused really on static energy efficiency to date. And so one of the efforts that we're partnering with a number of other agencies on is developing interoperability standards for transactive controls and communications amongst buildings and devices. And so that's an emerging area that we're pretty enthusiastic about. A couple other areas, I think we're very enthusiastic about advanced lighting. It's getting very close. There's still some work to do, especially LEDs. And then we're very interested in next-gen solid-state-based HVAC and water heating, which avoids any of the potent greenhouse gas working fluids that you have with existing HVAC units, and is an area where there's been a lot of progress, and we're looking to bring it into our portfolio.
Okay, great. When you look around the room, and obviously a lot of our advisors and speakers are maybe a little bit further down the road than some other companies may be, and I think, one of the questions I want to talk about is what is the role of government in terms of doing mandatory benchmarking, mandatory reporting? I mean, we're starting to see that there's a lot of cities that are putting regulations into place to force building owners, whether public sector, private sector building owners, to step it up a little bit. So we're seeing mandatory benchmarking, we're seeing mandatory reporting, and there's talk that the next step is going to be mandatory performance requirements for our buildings. So, Beth, I want to go to you first. I mean, what do you think the role of government is in terms of providing mandatory benchmarking and reporting, specifically, from private sector buildings?
Well, I think that it gives the private sector a certain amount of certainty that is the direction that we're going. And I would say I do a lot of work in New York. I do a lot of work here in DC, and kudos to both of those great cities, because the benchmarking requirements has sort of been a clarion call to the developers and certainly builders and others that support them to say, hey, look, sometime out in the future, there will be carbon cap and trade or some sort of a carbon system. We are dealing with resilience issues. That is where the market ultimately is going, and because buildings, unlike cars, are here for generations, you have to make smart decisions today. So those benchmarking requirements are essentially saying when you build a new building or when you renovate a building, which is a beautiful time to really raise your game in terms of the technology that you put into it, do it now, make that incremental investment, because what is it with the kind of technology change, you will be in a better position to raise your game in 3 years, 5 years, but 20, 30 years from now, you're going to need to do that in order to avoid risk. So I think that essentially government entities and leaderships within the government in terms of focusing on their own portfolio are emboldening the private sector to do what they ought to be doing in order to protect risk, their risk profile for the future.
Well, one of the challenges with the mandatory benchmarking is a lot of buildings say, well, we don't have that information, and we've got to do this every year, and it's a very manual process. So, Nina, where do you see the technology industry playing into this, the mandatory benchmarking, the reporting, the access to regular, if not real-time data? I mean, how does Tritium play into that?
Yeah, so I guess I have a little bit different perspective on the oversight. The technology part really is rather easy for us, because we can enable it in any way that they need the data. So we enable the access to the data. We help with the normalization of the data and then the delivery or the visualization of the data, right? So that for us is fairly easy, both from a device standpoint as well as from an application or a software engineering standpoint. That's not the hard part. For us anyways. What I've seen over the years in a number of different industries when you bring in the oversight, and I apologize if I upset anybody, I'm fairly conservative on this being from private sector. What I've seen is the R&D investment goes in the wrong direction. It goes towards meeting a set of standards as opposed to moving in the direction to new technologies that may enable even greater efficiencies. And so that's the fear I have anytime you impose those kinds of standards and put audits on them that are outside the private sector doing that themselves. I saw it in the 90s in the manufacturing business, specifically CAFE standards for automobiles. I saw our customers investing in certain technologies as opposed to renewable type technologies like battery power, electrification, and their propulsion systems. So we saw them doing that. That took them in the wrong direction, and then they had to completely reorganize the investment and in order to drive some of the next generation technologies, and we're probably ended up being about a decade behind on those technologies. So I've got a little bit different view of it on that side, the governance side of it. I think it's important. I think there needs to be a set of standards. The audits and those kinds of things, I think we have to figure out where to draw the line so that it makes sure that the investment continues in the right direction. But from a pure technology standpoint, for that part's easy for us. In fact, we're already doing it in our next generation of products that we'll be actually unveiling in about a month at our global conference in Las Vegas, are going to go the next step for us in the aggregation, the visualization of the data, as well as the power of the devices in order to be able to drive at lower price points a much broader view of portfolios of whether it's buildings or activities inside a building.
Okay, so Clayton, from your perspective, so I guess kind of let the market drive the business. Clayton, from your perspective, where do you feel the role of government is in terms of mandatory benchmarking, reporting, and ultimately performance standards for buildings?
Well, I think we got where we are without the government mandates. And I think, you know, the high profile, tallest building in town, nicest building in town, newest building in town is glitzy and fun and an easy target. But it's not going to create a whole lot of impact because we're doing what we can do already. I really feel that the opportunity is in the people that aren't in this room and the buildings that aren't represented in this room. And I think we've got to find a way for government to create a very doable, very realistic, cost-effective minimum and get those players to the table, because that's where we're going to gain the most. You know, by creating a standard that none of us in this room can create, all we're going to do is frustrate people and alienate them. So I really think our best opportunity is let's get the players that could do a lot more and help them find a way to do that cost effectively to make better buildings. And I don't think it's the Class A stuff. I think it's the B, C, D stuff.
True.
Mm-hmm. Dave?
Well, first I want you to know I'm with the government and I'm here to help. I came from the private sector too. You know, we have 5 core questions in my organization, the last of which is this a high impact proper role of government, right? So I'm on board with the team here. A few things I'd point out, you know, I think federal government with GSA at the lead, we can lead by example, right? And so, and we have a large fleet of buildings, and so I think the importance of us as a player at the table with the rest of the private sector and other folks to develop good standards, standard contracts, right? Standard approaches to energy service performance contracts, right? These are the kind of things that allow you to grow a market, to access larger pools of private capital and bring down your rates for financing energy efficiency investments. I think another very proper role of government in this space is the development of standardized data standards and formats, right? So we all got to get together. We're a natural convener to bring folks together so that if two major cities are doing this effort, they've used totally different data structures and data formats. It doesn't really help as much as it could. And so I think those are a couple areas that I think are very proper roles of government, leading by example and leading and convening to develop standardized approaches to contracts and other approaches that will actually allow us to take advantage of scale as it relates to accessing more finance or accessing, you know, a larger volume of products so we can actually bring costs down. Dan, you want to?
No, I think you hit on it. I think one of the ways that government can be more effective in encouraging development in this area is by just being a smarter consumer of space, of technology itself. And we've demonstrated that in the past. So GSA has led with green building certification and helped create a market for green building certification. I think we can be smarter in the way we engage with the people we lease buildings from. And I think we can be very clear in what our expectations are. And I think we can be smarter about the incentives we build into those leases. I've seen leases in which we actually pay a percentage handling fee on the energy consumed. You know, it is almost an incentive for someone to go and turn the lights on the weekend so that they can, you know, generate a higher handling fee. So we need to be smarter about the way we consume that space. We should be a smarter, more intelligent consumer so that we can encourage further development in the marketplace and create opportunities for new technology and great new ideas to come out of the private sector.
Which I think the transition from the old way that we operated buildings to the new smart building environment. I mean, obviously, you're going to hear a lot today about data and analytics and what's the next play for data and analytics in our buildings, and the importance of having real-time data. So Clayton, I want to go to you in terms of, you know, managing such a large portfolio and getting accurate data out of your buildings. How important is that technology play and the ability to access that data? And then what do you do with it?
Well, I think the key is getting the data in the right hands. To be real honest, data in my hands, as much space as I'm covering, is not going to solve the problem. It's data in the guys that's there every day. And it's giving them usable data, not just mounds of data. Right now, everybody's got too much data. I suggest that everybody in this room has more email than they want. And they wish that it would just get turned off for a couple of days to give them a chance to breathe, to figure out where they are. So massive amounts of data is really just a way to frustration and a juggernaut. So I think what we have to do is find a way to get the meaningful, usable data to them and then figure out a way to then get that data into a system to allow to lead from that data. So I think the buildings will get smarter. The data's already getting better. I'm not sure that I personally believe that a bunch of more meters is the simple answer. A lot of people believe meters everywhere is meter heaven, and that's probably pretty good if you sell meters or you're the power company that wants to charge on smaller rate structures. But if you have to take those meters and figure out what to do with them and keep them working all the time, I'm sure they're not the best answer. Credible, effective, carefully mined data, timely, to get it into the hands of the people that make decisions is the right answer.
Well, we're also seeing this new wave towards M2M communications and cloud-based computing and having that real-time data accessible anywhere. So, Nino, I want to ask you, where do you see the next step of that intelligent building play and the real-time data and that M2M communications? Because now not only can we access the data and act on it, but we're getting to the point where ultimately the machines will be able to communicate with themselves. So where do you see that trend going in buildings?
So there's a couple questions there. One's the technology itself, and where do we think the technology is going to evolve in a way. We clearly have the opportunity now with the right investments and over the next few years to put all of the building data into the cloud and create a more cost-effective model, a services-type model for technology versus the existing premise-based model, right? So make it more cost-effective to deliver that data. And we can deliver it from all the low-cost devices that are sensor-driven inside of a building versus even all the way down to, a plug in a room and what's the plug load, and we'd like to understand that, right? So we're there. And I think the cloud technologies, which is effectively the connectivity, are starting to reach a proliferation point, at least in the United States. In some parts of the world, we're not seeing it there yet. But at least in the United States, we're seeing the form factors on the sensors, the compute power on the smaller devices, the connectivity, as well as the delivery mechanisms to bring it up into a cloud-based system that you can then have a service, if you will. So rather than investing all the CapEx in the IT infrastructure required to manage that, you can buy it as a service. Salesforce.com, many of you may know that model. but deliver it up into a service in the cloud and consume the data that way. So it goes from a capital expenditure to an operations budget expenditure, and for some organizations, at least in the private sector, it's easier for them to consume that, to get the money and then consume it that way. So the technology is evolving, I think, quickly enough for us to be able to deliver that. Well, we're already going to be delivering it. So from that perspective, it's there. I think Clayton hits on the important point that we try to work with our customers on. How much data can you consume, and what do you want to do with it, right? Who's going to use it in your organizations, and what do you want to do with it, right? Sometimes we get overwhelmed with or too excited about the opportunity to have the data, and then to say, okay, now what are we going to do? And that's where it breaks down, right? Well, what action can the data's got to turn into information. The information's got to drive action or decisions, right? We've been saying that for many, many years in the IT industry. And so now that you've got all this, who's going to use it, and what are you going to do with it, right? Because regardless of how much it costs, if it just becomes nice charts, right, and it's not driving efficiency for all of you, then it wasn't a worthwhile investment, right? So those are the things that we're working with our customers on, especially the large enterprise customers. Over the last probably 12 to 18 months that I've seen a change in all sectors, not just buildings, but we've got the data now. What are we going to do with it to drive decisions? Right?
And I think, Dan, you had mentioned the ability to do predictive maintenance now, where we can literally know when a light bulb burns out before it burns out. So just final comments down the panel. I do want to ask, what do you see as the next step for efficient buildings, the next big technology, what is the future? So Clayton, I'm going to start with you. Where do you see the future of data analytics, intelligent buildings? What will we be talking about 5 years from now?
I think the biggest thing is we have an aging stock of buildings, and we're doing the industry as a whole is doing a fine job with the new buildings, putting new buildings up and making them cost effective and making LEED Gold as a minimum achievable standard. But, the real opportunity is going to be in repurposing and redoing old buildings and finding new technologies and ways to make them cost effectively more efficient and actually much nicer. We have some thoughts that maybe the big 20,000 square foot floor plan that used to be so desirable before may not be so desirable anymore because we don't need all the space for administrative support. I mean, most people in here are answering all their emails and letters, so to speak, while they're on the road, and files are kind of going away. So, the space is changing how people use it, and so maybe the 12,000 to 15,000, 10,000 square foot stuff gets more interesting. I also think that it'd be one hell of a good time to be getting in this business if you're 18 to 24. Mm-hmm. It'd also be a real good time to be 70 and getting out. But it's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to have a bunch of opportunities, and I think what everybody needs to do is load up with the best people, smartest people, most committed, and just the best people you can get. That's what's going to be the difference in it. And so we don't let anybody hire any Heinz people. There's no such thing as retirement or leaving. You just go away. So thank you.
Thanks, Beth.
I think that the way we work is going to change. I think it goes beyond the gadgets. The gadgets are great, but how we work together and how we take a look across the entire value chain, from how buildings are conceived to how they're designed, to how they're financed, to how they're evaluated, to how they're operated, and then the return around through sort of the cradle-to-cradle concept of what happens after that building is done. So creating more elegant connections across the stream of a building's life so that you don't have these awkward handoffs, and so data can actually flow from the design all the way through the operation of the building. And I also think that most of us probably in the room are largely focused on commercial, but 75% of all the buildings in the US are residential. 75% of those are single family detached houses. So finding a way to connect to the residential market, I think, is a huge challenge and opportunity, and then to focus on the subset of those buildings that are for a very underserved part of our community to bring everybody into a more sustainable future.
Dave?
I'd throw out two topics. I'd say one is that, a friend of mine who was on Capitol Hill was saying, you know, we love the smart grid. And I said, you know what it is? They're like, no, but we love it. And so one thing that is very clear to me is the smart grid has not arrived, but I think it's going to arrive over the next 5 to 10 years. And you know, especially going out into the next few decades, if we're going to achieve the kind of carbon emissions reductions we need to, that IPCC and others are telling us, we're going to need about 50% intermittent renewables by the middle of this century. And so that's going to require a very smart dynamic system. And so I think smart buildings, transactive communications and protocols are going to be critical. Second thing I'll throw out is something we're seeing with the success of CAFE standards is that as we're getting more efficient, it can create problems for a system that doesn't expect us to be efficient. For example, we don't have enough funds in the Highway Trust Fund because we're not paying enough for gasoline and gas tax. And so how are we going to actually upgrade the roads? And so I think it will be incumbent upon us to think, if we're wildly successful, which we must be, we will be on efficiency, what are the other parts of the system that we need to think about? How are we going to deal with huge amounts of stranded assets out there that maybe won't be needed when we get very efficient? So I think from a societal perspective, that's something we've got to get ahead of.
Great. Dan, final word.
I completely agree with everything that's just been said. I think actually Clayton's point about taking data and through analysis converting it into useful information is really one of the big frontiers. Collecting data has gotten easier and easier because of Moore's laws and all its ancillary cousins and brothers about reducing the cost of storage, reducing the cost of computing power, reducing the cost of information technology and sharing of information has produced huge amounts of data. Wading through it and finding useful information, actionable information, is an area I think we're going to see an awful lot of work happening in. And then I also think, to David's point, as well as Elizabeth's point, there needs to be a transformation in the way we fund these investments and recognize that they are in fact investments.
Great, thank you. And would you please join me in thanking our wonderful general session opening panelists.